We all want our knits to be incredibly soft, right? I know I'm always on the lookout for a great stitch, and I found one that I'm excited to share with you today because it gives you a really stretchy and squishy fabric. So the single color brioche stitch is just a very simple 2-row pattern repeat. So what we're going to do is first look at the setup row because that's a little bit different than those 2 rows. We'll cover the first row and the second row in that repeat, and then I want to talk to you about tinking or reverse knitting. Brioche is not very easy to rip out if you make a major mistake, but you can rip back a couple stitches and it's pretty manageable. So I'll share that with you, little tips that I've learned along the way for that, and we'll look at the bind off, and that'll be it. You'll be on your way to brioche knitting in no time. Now that's what's on the agenda for us today. Before we dive into the studio though, I want to take a quick moment to thank my sponsor, Red Heart, for allowing me to teach you this topic here today. Brioche knitting is a wonderful technique. It's a great versatile stitch, and I find that it's really great to use with Red Heart Scrubby Smoothie. This is a brand new yarn to the Scrubby line. I particularly like their variegated colorways, like this one called Refreshing. This is going to be great to add some visual interest to your swatches, your washcloth, whatever you're going to make out of this brioche swatch that we're going to work here in the tutorial, so you don't have to worry about a 2-color brioche until you're ready to take that step. Now I know you're excited to dive into brioche knitting. Thank you for listening to that little tidbit. Before we go, let's see how it's done. The first thing we're going to do is cast on an odd number of stitches to start the brioche pattern. Now you can work any type of cast on method that you want. I prefer the long tail cast on. I find it very easy for me to work. And I'm going to do just 11 stitches for a little swatch here, and it's a good idea to do a practice swatch before you dive into a big project. So if you want to work right along with me, go ahead and cast on 11 stitches. Now the first row when we're working the brioche stitch is going to be different from the other 2 repeated rows. So we're going to cover a setup row here, and then we'll move into row 1 and row 2, which are the repeats. So the first stitch we want to knit. Then we're going to bring the yarn forward, or we're going to make a yarn over, just like that. So it's kind of steadying on the bottom of that needle. And then we're going to slip the next stitch purlwise. So I'll insert my needle into the stitch just as if I were going to purl it, but instead of purling, I'm just going to slip it onto this needle here. And we're going to leave the yarn where it is, and we want to knit the next stitch. And when we do this, we're going to have an extra wrap on our needle because that yarn was in forward. So you can see it right here kind of goes at an angle. And that's the repeat. We're going to yarn over, insert our needle purlwise into the next stitch, slip it over, and then knit the next stitch. Yarn over, slip the next one purlwise, and knit. Now just in case a yarn over is new to you and you're a continental knitter, which means you hold your working yarn in your non-dominant hand, let me show you what that looks like. So I would be holding my work just like this, and a yarn over, I'm just going to grab it with that back needle. So it's kind of just laying over the top of it. Then I will slip one purlwise, and that yarn is still forward there, and then we're going to knit the next one. You have to bear with me because this is not my usual knitting style. And then just knit the next one. So that's how you would do it continental style. I'm going to switch things back over. I've got just a couple stitches here, so I'll yarn over, slip one purlwise, and then I'm going to knit the last stitch. And that's all there is to the setup row. If you're working a larger piece, if you decide to jump right into a project here with this tutorial, you'll finish that repeat until you get to the end of the row, and things should work out as they did here, where we make a knit in the last stitch, and that's how you know that you're on the right track. The other thing you can do is have a look at your work and make sure that you have what looks to be a normal stitch and then what looks to be that yarn over, or where you have the strand that's kind of crossing over. Now when you see this yarn over stitch right here, that is your brioche stitch, abbreviated BRK, and you're going to get very familiar with that as we move on to row number 2. Now row number 2, we're going to start that off by knitting the first stitch. And this is actually the start of the next row as well, so that's just something you can commit to memory there. We're always going to knit the first stitch. Now when we come to our next stitch, this is a brioche stitch, and I can tell that because it has that yarn over. It's kind of laying over on top. What I want to do is insert my needle knitwise, but I want to catch both of those stitches, so the yarn over and the stitch, and just knit them as if they were one. Then I'm going to yarn over and slip the next one purlwise. Another thing I want to point out is that the stitch that's available to slip is a single stitch, or the one that we slipped from the previous row. That's very important in order to maintain our stitch pattern. So from here, our next stitch is a brioche stitch. So I'll insert my needle knitwise and just basically knit those two together. Now yarn over. The next one is a stitch that I can just slip one purlwise, and then brioche. And we'll just keep going until we get to the end. And when you get to the end of the row, I did a brioche stitch there. I want to make sure I just go ahead and knit that last stitch. And that's going to finish row 2. Now we're moving right along to row number 3, which is the final row of the stitch pattern repeat for this brioche knit stitch. And all we'll need to do is turn our work, and we're set up to go. On the first stitch, we want to knit. Then we're going to yarn over and slip one purlwise. Now the next is a brioche, so we're going to brioche knit, yarn over, slip one purlwise, brioche knit, and you're pretty much getting the hang of it by now. Now when we get to the last one, you saw I made a yarn over, I slipped one purlwise, and I'm going to knit the last stitch with that yarn in front to finish off row number 3. Now it really doesn't look like much here. We have to get several rows before we can really establish the pattern, the texture, and the feel of this stitch. So I encourage you to go ahead and work up a few more rows, just as we've covered here. So the next one we're going to start off with is row number 2, then row number 3, and we're going to repeat that over and over. And the next thing I want to do is talk to you a little bit about some troubleshooting, and then we're going to work on the cast off. One of the most common things that I did when I was brioche knitting was whenever I would try to slip purlwise, just instinct kicked in, and I always purl to that stitch instead of just slipping it. And I did that naturally without even thinking about it. Now if you catch it before you do your brioche knit, then it's really simple. You'll just pass it back over. But if you realize that after you've already done a brioche knit, you'll have to do a little bit of tinking. So let's have a look at how you would do that. So when you yarn over, you insert your needle purlwise, and just out of pure habit, you go ahead and purl that stitch. What do? Well, you don't need to panic. It's relatively easy to undo. So take a look at my working yarn, how it's coming up from the top, and around that you can see a loop that kind of goes up and down. That is where we need to focus our attention, because I want to catch just the side of that with my opposite needle. And once I catch that, I'm just steadying it with my finger so that I can slide that loop off and pull it through. Now we're basically at the point to where we were before, so then I would just go ahead and yarn forward and slip this purlwise. Well, let's say for some odd reason I need to tink that stitch. Let's say maybe I made a mistake back here and I need to get back to it. Well, how do you tink a brioche knit? Well, the first thing you'll need to do is just look at the back of your work. You can see those two loops that are coming out from the working yarn. Looks very similar to how it did a moment ago with the purl, but of course it's in the back because it was a knit. Well, what I want to do is grab those two loops and then slide this off, and now we're basically back to where we were before. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, if you make a major mistake and you need to rip back several rows in brioche knitting, the only way to do that is to make sure that you have a lifeline in place. And that's basically where you're going to take a scrap piece of yarn and you're going to run it through the stitches. And you'll want to do that every so often, because that's going to be your lifeline. So when you make a mistake, you'll have to rip back or frog to that line, and then you can put the needle through those stitches. Now, let me just tell you from my experience, I tried to just rip out a row and place my needle back into that and pick it up and keep going as normal. I do that a lot, actually. I was not successful with brioche knitting. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm sure it could be. I wasn't able to do it. And so I recommend that if you're really worried about making a mistake, let's say you're making a really long project, like a scarf or a garment or something like that, you want to make sure you have that lifeline in place, just so you don't have to rip back and start from the very beginning. And we've covered all of the basics so far. You understand the cast on and the amount of stitches, basically the multiple that it needs to be worked in. You know how to do the setup row, the row 1 and row 2 repeats, so you're repeating those over and over. The last little bit of information you need is how to bind off. So let's have a look at that. The first thing you want to do when you're binding off is make sure that you're doing so with the right side facing you. And I'm not going to tell you to memorize which row of the repeat is going to be the right or the wrong side. There's actually an easier way to figure that out. So what I do is look at the very bottom edge and take a nice look at how this bottom edge looks from this angle versus when I flip it over and look at it this way. See how it's a little bit more bumpy on this side? This is what I call the wrong side of the work. And this looks a little bit neater, so this is the right side. So make sure that you're looking at this bottom edge when you're ready to bind off. And the concept is pretty much the same. There is a couple things that we're going to do differently. Now, one thing you'll notice is that the brioche stitch is a really stretchy, flexible fabric. So what I like to do is actually drop one of my needles that I'm working with and go up a couple of sizes. So the red ones here, these are 5mm needles, and I'm going to switch to a 6.5mm needle for my bind off. And that's for a couple of reasons. One, because I typically like to bind off a lot tighter than my regular stitches, so that creates a top edge that's maybe kind of puckered like this, and I don't want that. So taking your new needle, we're going to continue with our stitch pattern repeat, but of course we're going to bind off as we go. So I'm going to knit the first stitch, and then the next one is a brioche knit. So I'm going to brioche knit just as if I were working the regular stitch pattern, and then I'm going to pass this loop over this one, and that is going to bind that stitch off. Now the next stitch here is where I would yarn over and slip one purlwise, but what I'm going to do is instead of slipping it purlwise, I'm just going to purl it like normal, just like a normal stitch. Then I want to pass this one over this one, and to do that I always just pull my yarn at the back and kind of tighten it up. Pass it over to bind it off. Now the next one is a brioche knit, so I'm going to just knit that one, pass it over. And that's the repeat. Just look at that purl the same, so I'm going to pull it to the front, purl the stitch. I like to pull my yarn to the back so that it gets it out of the way. Pass it over. And then when you get to the last stitch, we're just going to knit that. And then still pass that last one over. And then you're just ready to fasten off. And you can see that by using this larger needle, it helps my bind off edge match my cast on edge. I appreciate your time and attention today. Before you go, I'd really love to know what you would like to make with a brioche knit, or what type of project do you think would be great for this stitch now that you've seen it, felt it, and you know how it works up. Leave that in the comments section below. Things like that really steer the direction of the projects that I create and the tutorials that I publish for you. So leave that in the comments section below, and you never know, you might see a project with that recommendation. Also, be sure to check out Red Heart Scrubby Smoothie yarn. Seriously guys, this is a wonderfully soft cotton. That's one of my biggest pet peeves with cotton, is that it's really stiff and it hurts my fingers. Now this is strong, don't get me wrong, so when you pull on it, you're not gonna have a lot of stretch. It's so soft, it's so easy to work with, and the colorways are great. I love these short color variations. Really great for washcloths too, by the way. So you wanna check that out if you haven't done so already. If you need the information for that, you can find it linked in the video description below. And if you need a step-by-step instruction for the pattern and everything we covered here in the tutorial, you want to be sure to head over to bhookedcrochet.com/brioche, and that's going to basically just have everything spelled out right for you there on that page. Easy to access, one of those pages that's great to bookmark. So go ahead and bookmark that link and you'll have it the next time you want to start a project. Thank you so much for spending so much time with me today. I'm so grateful, you have no idea. If you haven't done so already, please go ahead and subscribe to the B.Hooked YouTube channel. As you know, I put out tutorials for crochet projects as well as knitting projects. And when you subscribe, you'll be one of the first to know when I publish a brand new video. Check out all of the hundreds of videos that I have just right there, waiting for you to binge on. I know you're gonna binge watch, and when you do, tweet me about it or tell me on Instagram. I love to hear that kind of stuff. All right, bye guys. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next episode of B.Hooked.